But Steve, acutely aware we're running out of time. Do you want me to quickly run through Adobe?
Yeah, I do. I've written down Mozambique tuna bonds for the show notes, but let's go with Adobe instead.
Okay, cool. So, Adobe, this was their first quarter of 2023. These earnings were pretty good, I thought. They managed revenue of $4.66 billion, obviously just in this quarter. That was a 9% year-over-year growth, but 13% if you're taking it in constant currency. Diluted earnings per share was $2.71 on a GAAP basis and $3.80 on a non-GAAP basis if you, for some reason, want to take stock-based comp out. GAAP operating income for the first quarter was $1.59 billion, non-GAAP $2.13 billion, GAAP net income was $1.25 billion, and non-GAAP net income was $1.75 billion. Cash flow from operations was $1.69 billion, and remaining performance obligations RPO was about $15.21 billion. Adobe also said that they repurchased about 5 million shares during the quarter, so that's quite positive. So a couple of things I nicked out the call, Steve. CFO Dan Dern, which is an excellent name. It seems like something Bob Mortimer would have come up with. Q1 was a strong start to the year for Adobe. I know the macroeconomy is on every investor's mind right now, and you can see the resilience and diversification of Adobe's business in our financial results. In this environment, the demand for our products continues to be strong as our solutions are mission critical to customers in a world where digital content and engagement drive the global economy. I can't think of a company that's better positioned as we continue to innovate in our core business and create and scale emerging businesses to drive profitable growth. On Figma, CFO Dan Dern said the potential combination continues to be well received by our customers, industry analysts and partners. I'm not sure that's necessarily the truth because it halved in price on it. But in addition, we are preparing for integration as we work through the regulatory process. From the outset, we've been well prepared for all potential scenarios while realistic about the regulatory environment. We have completed the discovery phase of the US DOJ second request and are prepared for the next steps, whether that is an approval or challenge. Discovery, for anybody who isn't really up with US law, is essentially when the prosecution team asks Adobe for tons and tons of information. Adobe has to provide all of it, and if from that the prosecution decide whether they're going to press on or whether they're just going to say, wave it through. But Steve, that was Adobe. I think I whistled through that. I apologize, there's a lot of numbers in there, but anything in there jumping out at you?
Yeah, growth and buybacks in what is on the face of it, tricky macroeconomic environment, but maybe not if you're a software company, right? Are you that bothered about inflation? I take it they don't have huge amounts of price inputs. One thing I've not heard from Adobe, at least, and it may be happening, but it's not as prominent as everywhere else, is massive job layoffs. So I'm not aware they've been cutting huge numbers of staff. I assume their biggest cost probably is staff, because I find it hard to see what else their cost would be. But they are still managing to grow pretty nicely. And okay, stock-based comp seems sort of reasonably high. It took that EPS number from 2-something to 3-something. Remind me again.
So 271 was diluted earnings per share on GAAP and 380 on non-GAAP.
Yeah, so that's a bit of a push there, I think, in sort of slightly higher number, about 30% more maybe. So there's a kind of good amount coming through on that. But look, Adobe I like the way they think about things as kind of mission critical, and it's the kind of thing people can't really do without, partly because it's a bit sticky, but partly because it's very, very hard to run your business without this kind of thing. And switching costs are very high here, I think. If you have a big workforce and they're used to using Adobe stuff, moving them across and retraining them to something else is a cost that I guess a lot of companies feel they can do without.
Yeah, and also, the only real competitor to Adobe that you hear spoken about in designer circles is Figma, and they've acquired it. I mean, they've acquired it for a hell of a premium, or what we think is a hell of a premium, but they obviously see there's some real value in that, and if this gets waved through, and I think it probably will. Adobe has been the leader in design forever and has always been allowed to expand that moat, so I don't see why they would want to destroy a company of this kind of size. But I guess we'll see. On Adobe, yes, I haven't seen anything on layoffs, actually. That's a very interesting point, but the problem is that probably a lot of the companies they supply have. So we are seeing that revenue growth slow ever so slightly. I mean, 9% of a company of Adobe's size is still good growth. It's actually been crushed by currencies. Also 13% if you're talking about constant currency. I think that's pretty good growth. I actually saw on Twitter a lot of people saying, well, this is the end of Adobe growth. We're going into like single digit growth. And I actually don't think that's probably the case. I think, and outside of this tightening environment, I could probably see Adobe going back to, mid double digit growth, something like 15%.
Yeah, and that would work just nicely on a company with fairly strong operational leverage and pretty high margins. Adobe is the company that we like to think about as a kind of barometer for what kind of tech companies might be if they scale and sort of do reasonably well. Just looking at the stock, actually, it's rallied a little bit after having been down. It's up quite nicely on the year, I think, of about 5% or so, and most of that today, to be honest. But it's also down fairly healthily over the last year or so. Any interest in buying this, Steve?
Yes and no, really. I am interested in buying Adobe sort of perpetually, but I just never seem to have any money when it's in an attractive kind of place. I have bought and sold it on a number of occasions as I've just come across what I feel are better ends, and I always get the sort of middling fear of AI picture generation and things like that, especially when I've used it and come up with decent things myself. I start to think, well, what was the point? I mean, I did have to throw it in Photoshop to tidy it up, but I mean, I don't even use Photoshop for doing our thumbnails anymore, so I do kind of worry that maybe it doesn't have the stickiness, but it also feels like that's really anecdotal because I'm sat looking at these cracking earnings thinking, this is a great company, Steve.
Yeah, it's doing well. I've seen a few tech things like this doing sort of fairly well, actually, just almost as it were quietly, getting on with making more money and building out their growth and signing up more people and so on and so forth. Yeah, interesting stuff. I'm also constantly interested in Adobe, but in my case, I always just seem to find something else to go for. That thing is very often Amazon, by the way. So that's why I haven't bought and sold it. I think at all in the past, but certainly not much, and certainly not in any kind of significant way.